Welcome to a brand new episode of Marti Talks, produced by Purse First Productions, Bob the Drag Queen, and Mitch Farino. I'm your host, Marti Cummings, and today we are joined by one of my all-time favorite comedians. We've been friends for 827 years, probably. The one and only Phillip Henry. Welcome to the show!
Hi, Marty. How are you? I'm so excited to do this.
Girl, okay, this is our first in-person interview we've done. We're coming at you from Philip's apartment down the street from mine.
Absolutely. Live and in color. In
Yes.
This beautiful rent-stabilized home.
Honey, but don't worry, we are safe. We are masked up and socially distanced.
Yes, absolutely. I tested negative like 2 days ago. We're good, okay?
We gotta dive in because I've known you for a long time.
Absolutely.
Through the scene. We made a music video years ago.
Yes. Oh my God. Do you want to go to Brunch Girl?
Do you want to go to Brunch Girl? Yeah, with PD and Patrick.
Kazara.
Yeah.
And who else was it? That was just us. It was the
I think
Jamie Hendrix wasn't in that. Somebody else was.
It's an all-star cast.
It was a lot of people pulling up.
I want to talk, a little bit about your life in New York, getting into stand-up comedy, and now I was so honored to work with you and some of our friends, Shakina, who was on our last episode, Jamie Sapiro, Condola Rashad. Who else was working with us on Deja?
Deja Smith. Who else did we have there? A lot of people.
We've been working on our Uptown Political Action Group, and so I was so honored to help you put together the Juneteenth event, which I want to talk about, in a little bit. But let's start at the very beginning. So, how long have you been in New York? How'd you get here?
I moved to New York in 2012. I was actually born in New York.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
In the city?
I was born in the Bronx. I lived in the Bronx. I went to elementary school in New York. And then we moved to Georgia, to a little town called Douglasville. It's about 20 minutes west of Atlanta. I went there. I stayed there. I went to college at University of Georgia in Athens, and then I moved right back to New York after all of that. I was just like, I gotta get out of the South, and
you just gotta go.
Yeah, and
you
I just
gotta go.
Ran. I was packed up my stuff and ran with 6 bags and a dream.
Yeah, what was it like growing up in Georgia?
It was interesting. Ultimately, because I grew up in what has now become a very different place. Like when I grew up in the town that I grew up in, it was like a very white suburb. It was extremely conservative. There were about maybe 30 Black people in my graduating class of 400 people.
Oh, wow.
So it was a really, really small, as far as Black and diverse community there, through middle school and high school. And the funniest thing is that now when I go back and it's kind of the opposite, a lot of Black people from Atlanta have moved out into the neighborhood. The county went blue in 2016 in that election. So I was really, really, I've been shocked to learn this, but yeah, I grew up around Confederate flags waving on the back of trucks going to high school. So it was very, very, interesting and eye-opening, but also in a way that I kind of adapted, at least politically, a lot of things that I think now I look back on them and I'm I can't believe that I've just moved so much further left than I ever was then. And I think I accepted a lot of things.
Very same. Growing up, I grew up in the country, and growing up in that atmosphere, it's our society tells people so often how to think or what's supposed to be normal when now as adults, you and I know oh, this is not good.
Yeah. College started to be that awakening for me. I was wait, this is bad. These things are bad, right? And you start to realize and come into those things. I think you're growing up. Also, you're a high schooler, right? In high school, I didn't really give a shit about these things.
Yeah.
Not as much as I certainly do now. And I think when you're surrounded by a certain viewpoint only and in mass, I think mostly you start your political imagination is stunted to the limits of what can be achieved.
Well, that's
right?
yeah. Okay, so for example, my husband grew up Mormon, and his sister, not to throw her under the bus, but his sister has a very closed-minded view of the world, and it's when you are only talking to other people from your church, and you're only watching Fox News, and your only reference point is that, then of course your views are going to be
your views are totally
that,
shaped by that.
yeah.
And then even if you have like the proclivity, if you like could be someone who moved further left, right? Being surrounded by people who don't believe anything near those things kind of stunts your imagination to limit what you think is possible, right? You're like, well, these people don't even believe that like gay people should exist. Much less could I envision a world where like gay people could get married, right? Like, so that's how that kind of goes. Even if you want to believe those things, if you could believe like gay people can be married, trans people deserve rights, all of those things, being surrounded by people who don't believe them kind of like really stunts that opportunity. And that's kind of what it was for me. Like, I finally got around people who actually were like, no, you don't have to accept these things in the world. We can actually change them.
We can change them. Yeah. That's what's been so exciting the last like several years, you know, in the time that we've known each other. Also, just like I felt like such a growth in both of us, you know, like we kind of like grew up in New York, I feel,
absolutely,
and learning and growing and like evolving as human beings in our thought process. And now, like, I hope that we're able to take that back to Georgia or back to Texas where my sister-in-law is and be like, hey, this is like actually like gay people deserve rights.
Yeah.
Trans people deserve rights.
Yeah.
The police should stop killing black people. Yeah. You know, our schools should be equal education. We should have healthcare for all. You know, these are basic things. Yeah. And now we're able to go and
yeah, I think you're able to now to educate and also to facilitate those conversations with people who like and at least know how to navigate them, right? Like to me, every talking point against I think especially like politically, they're all the same because they all come from the same place, right? Sure. Like they're all a fruit of one very poisonous tree that is like the like Republican news media outlet and all of those pundits. They
Surely,
push out
bad apples.
Yeah, they literally put out all of the same stuff. So I'm like, I know what your argument, I know what you're going to say. Yeah, like I know all of your like false equivalencies because you all are making these same exact points, right?
Now, you don't hold back on Twitter.
I don't.
Let's talk about the tweets, baby. Okay. Twitter is a dumpster fire.
It is a hell site. It's truly insane.
You don't hold back though. Like you go full tilt, and I'm obsessed.
At this point, I don't feel the need to do that, right? I think so much of like being on the internet, and especially for myself, who's like my entire everything that I have, right? I've built any sort semblance of a career that I have. Everything like comes from being on the internet, and then like quite frankly, being like as I grow as a person, it's always changing, but part of my growth and my following has come from being exactly who I am, right? Like I'm going to tell you exactly how I feel about this thing because that's what you want from me, right? Like the sanitized version of like, this is what is morally acceptable and what people want to hear, or like is going to make like particularly like Democratic people or like people who consider themselves liberal, it's like comfortable and fine listening to. It's not something that like I aspire to. I have zero desire to tiptoe around liberation because ultimately your comfort level is not yours particularly, but anyone's comfort level is far less important to me than
you in general.
The you in general. Is far like liberation is far more important to me than like your feelings around things.
Oh, I agree with that.
Like that. So I'm like, if this makes you uncomfortable to hear about anything, whether it be like Joe Biden or other like Democratic officials, I'm like, Democrats and Republicans can all get the smoke, right? Like you can all.
Well, that's the thing. We have to like stand up and say like, yes, of course we're voting for Biden. Of course we're voting for that ticket because Trump, like 4 more years of Trump will truly end our country, I believe. But while voting in 2020, we can say, okay, I'm voting for you, and now I'm going to say we need Medicare for all, so we're going to push for that. We need to defund the police. We're going to continue to push for that. And
yeah, I think that you can push for all of these initiatives no matter who's in office, right? Like ideally, Trump is not the president. That is obviously like the most ideal situation is that Trump is no longer president of the United States of America. He's a terrible person. I think also, though, is that there's, for I think a lot of people, and I think getting the luxury of being like not living in a swing state, right? I'm a New York voter. Like whenever I vote for like this state will always go blue no matter what. I don't really have to worry about that so much. So I feel like ultimately electoral politics and voting for me isn't the way that like is going to really activate or create the change that I think really needs to happen ultimately, because this state's always going to go that way. So I don't have like an influence in politics.
Well, we
in
got to
that
keep
way.
voting local and state because we got to make sure,
everybody should be voting for all measures.
Because Albany just became blue. In the state pot, because upstate New York is conservative as fuck.
They are very, very red. And
and Long Island too. Ugh,
yes.
girl.
Oh my God. Everything east of Brooklyn is like you can just like bet on it being red. I think anywhere out. I ultimately, if I'm not in the tri-state, like if I'm not in the 5 boroughs,
even Staten Island's red too, girl.
Is it?
Oh, honey, Staten Island.
Yeah,
she's Republican down there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Get out of here, Staten Island.
That's okay.
Let it sink, honey.
They can they can secede. Honestly, I don't really.
Oh my God.
But
I love you're loud as fuck on Twitter, and I'm obsessed. And how do you like infuse that into your comedy? Do you ever feel like how like when you're in front of an audience? Like I've had people in my audience like be like heckle me because they're like a Trump supporter. I'm like, bye, get out.
Yeah. Well,
I kick them out. I don't care. I just
ultimately, I don't really. I talk actually not very much about politics when it comes to my comedy. I think I generally talk about. I mean, I think I do just in a way that isn't like particularly like talking about Donald Trump, right? I don't like have to talk about Donald Trump to talk about racism, to talk about homophobia, to talk about all of the things that he like kind of espouses and puts out of there. Mm-hmm. So I don't talk about him particularly, and I don't talk about like politics particularly. I infuse my politics into the point of view that I share, right? So if I'm talking about racism that I've like experienced and want to make a joke about it, then we'll talk about it that way. But I don't necessarily like have where I'm like a bit on Donald Trump. I just really don't. I'm interested more so in talking about the types of things that he's doing that continue to happen whether he's in office or not.
Well, that's the thing that I always try to highlight. Like it's like Donald Trump is a horrible, shitty, morally bankrupt, evil human being, but there's an entire system that has allowed him to get into office. So it's not just him. There's an entire political party, and not just the Republican political party, but the system at large that has allowed him to get into office.
We operate in a political system that ultimately, and I'd say the same thing. I'd say that like it's not just Republicans, it's not just Democrats, it's also Democrats like total apathy over the years of like allowing these kinds of things. I'm like all Donald Trump is doing right now in that White House is pulling the levers that like Republicans and Democrats built together. And like you built this system that could descend into fascism very easily.
Very quickly, yeah.
Very easily. And you were just hoping that it never got into the wrong hands. And now it's in the wrong hands, and you're mad that you built
with a whole team of enablers.
Exactly.
They're like, yeah.
And then everybody else fell in line. But I'm like, you built the system, right? Like, I think ultimately, I'm like, and that's why
that's so important to highlight.
And I'm like, you've created this, and now essentially, what I think that that ultimately the Democratic Party has been doing recently is hinging its idea on this idea that they can also fix it. And I think a lot of people have concerns about that, right? And I think that the party is going to have to really reevaluate, especially after 2020, if they want to continue to win elections, which I suspect, I'm like, if you want to continue winning elections moving forward, you're going to have to make changes as a party. Like, you can't keep pandering to the right. Like that, like we can't keep moving further right because right people keep moving further right. Because Donald Trump's a fascist, now we're moderate Republicans. Like, that's not how that goes.
That's like,
because,
for example, like today, okay, Jane Lynch just tweeted today of this recording. Yeah. She was like, we should name the Senate building after John McCain. And I'm like, y'all remember that John McCain was anti-gay marriage, pro-Iraq war, like, y'all, hello.
No.
Called
his wife the C word in front of reporters. has said that he would die hating Asian people is a
I'm
garbage
like, why are we
person.
gonna want to and people are like, oh, Bush is not so bad. I'm like,
Yes,
he is. He's
These
a
people
war
are-
criminal.
Like these people are bad.
Yeah,
and everyone skirts around that because we've been
because now we're so desensitized because Trump is
so
bad that we're like, oh my god, I wish it was the time. And I'm like, nah, bitch.
You wanna go-
McCain sucked, Bush sucked, Romney's still a piece of shit. No, ma'am.
I'd say looking back, Obama wasn't that great either. We have Democrats. We've made the political system as it exists currently has always kind of pandered to the right? We have spent decades, right? When you look at the crime bill, when you look at DOMA, those are both pieces of Democratic legislation, right? They put those things into place. The ones who took the Defense of Marriage Act was written by Democrats. It is a piece of Democratic legislation, and we have to now say, okay, well, people are changing their views, and I'm absolutely
well. It is important also to I do think it is important to allow people in politics to grow.
Absolutely.
Because if we want to make change, we have to say, okay, 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, you voted this way, or you thought this. How have you listened, learned, and now implementing that knowledge into the legislation you're joining
that you're signing up for now? And that's the question that we all have to ask ourselves ultimately, because I come from, I think more now than ever, from the belief as we watch protests lead to cities, literally some cities are actually defunding their police departments, right? Because of protests. I think Austin is doing a major defunding. Some other cities have Minneapolis.
I want to get into defunding the police, but first we need to take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. Thank you so much, sponsors. We are back with Phillip Henry, and we were just diving into the conversation of defunding the police, what that looks like in cities that are making this happen. So let's talk about this.
Yeah, so I think electoral politics as they exist, which is showing up to vote every 4 years, putting people into office, is absolutely kind of a basic way to maybe try and get change. But if we look to me, over the course of our political history, the majority of legislative changes and civil rights changes that we've been able to accomplish in this country have not come through voting. Voting is a bare minimum. It is really not the standard that creates the type of change that everybody puts into it, right? When we look at the civil rights movement, when we look at the Civil Rights Act, right? We watched a group of people in this country rise up through protests, a lot of which became extremely violent and were very, very gross. But a lot of people died.
Did you tweet? Was it you that tweeted yesterday that protests don't need to be peaceful?
I did.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
I thought
they
so.
don't.
Yeah.
I don't think that they really need to, because ultimately, I think violence is the only language that this country and that the people who run this country understand, because it's founded on slavery and genocide. It's founded on violence. Violence is the state base. It is our state. It is our nation state total thing. That's what we do. But more importantly, I think that when you look at the Civil Rights Act or the Civil Rights Movement, we watched Black people. We desegregated schools, got rights and civil rights protections for Black people, got the right to vote, all without voting. Right,
by taking to the streets,
the streets and making those changes and putting pressure on politicians, right? Democratic politicians, Republican politicians, making their lives hell and uncomfortable until they gave Black people their rights. Even gay marriage, right? It really came. We didn't get that. It was taken away through legislation. Honestly, it was but we didn't get gay marriage through that. We got it through the courts, right? So ultimately, I think that depending on legislative action in the way that is just oh, well, we're just going to vote for this person and they're going to figure it out, is the wrong mindset.
Well, we have to, once people are voted, we have to stay loud to ensure stuff,
And
protesting works.
Protesting absolutely works.
Yeah.
Protesting works. If it didn't work, they wouldn't be trying to stop it so much, right? That's really it. And that we're not protesting, and there's so much messaging around defunding the police and all of that is oh, all of this protesting is leading to a race war. And I'm no. I'm like, we're trying to end a race war that's been happening in this
for
country
400 years.
For 400 years,
for
right?
400
Like,
years,
we're
yeah.
like the only people, and it's the funniest thing to me is that like so much of the way that people like operate, navigating protests and navigating this moment is from an understanding that like they don't understand that we're already in a war. Like, we're not starting one. Like,
we've been in one for 400 years.
The class war and the race war already exist. The only people who know that we're fighting it, it seems to be, are the people who are waging it against people.
Well, I mean, look at what's happening in COVID, right? Like, there's going to be 50 million Americans who are going to be starving. There's unemployment is at an all-time high. People are not able to pay the rent. Homelessness is going to be on the rise. Jobs aren't coming back. But industries are shutting down. But the wealthiest among us, Jeff Bezos, has made like $50 billion in this, you know, and I'm just using him as an example because he's the wealthiest man in the world. But like all these other billionaires are making money, and the poor are getting poorer. So the divide is
it exists already.
It's been existing, and now it's exacerbated.
It's existed, and it's being exploited in the way. What we're seeing right now with COVID is capitalism and the system working exactly as it is designed to work.
You know Keisha Carr. Everybody follow Keisha Carr, one of my favorite drag queens. She posted this thing today that said, "If capitalism is so great, why does socialism need to bail it out every 10 years?" And I was go off, sis.
That's it.
Yeah, that's it.
That's exactly what it is. Is that like this system is working exactly as it was designed to work.
Well, that's the same with the. Oh, sorry to interrupt.
It's to keep allowing like wealthy people to make money under any circumstances, because having money gets you more money, and those who don't have it, watching them struggle and then telling everybody like, oh, just like pick yourself up from your bootstraps. And I'm like, sis, I don't have shoes. So like, what are you talking about? Like you've created it so that I cannot do that, right?
Well, this is why going back to the defunding the police. This is why when people are like, "Oh, the wording of defunding," I'm like, "Fuck that!" Like, no, we want to defund the police.
Absolutely.
And you know what we can do with that money? For New York, for example, has a $6 billion NYPD budget. If we took $1 or $2 billion out of that, they'd still have a very big budget to do all those shit they want to do, and we could put that money into housing, justice for all, equal education. New York is one of the most segregated school systems in the country.
Absolutely.
Like, isn't that a gag?
It's disgusting.
And it's because you have, people on the Upper East Side, Upper West Side who's like, oh, I'm progressive, but I don't want my kids going to school with those kids.
People. Oh, absolutely. Because they're not really, those are the same people that, like...
It's what's happening on the Upper West Side right now with people experiencing homelessness and addiction, where they're like, oh, we have to help homeless people, but now they're on my street?
No, exactly.
Not anymore. It's so awful.
They only want it's only in theory, right? It's only, all of these politics and principles really only exist for people. There are people, like I like to say, that have politics versus people who have PR, right? Which is that, like, publicly... people who have politics and principles believe their principles and are willing to do what it takes to make those things happen. People with PR are the people who are like, I agree with your principles, but they don't actually have any desire. It's all like, there's no desire to actually follow it up. If you tell a rich person, or you tell someone that lives on the Upper West Side, hi, we're going to start putting some like affordable housing in your neighborhood, or put some affordable housing units in this building, you watch them lose their minds, right? Watch all of that, like, that left's like, oh yes, I support Democrats, I support gay marriage, I was marching last week, and then you tell them that, like, we're going to put affordable housing in a homeless shelter in this neighborhood, and they will go crazy, right? But the funniest thing is that you tell them that you're going to put a private prison in their neighborhood, and it's going to bring more funding into that neighborhood. They all love it, right? Like,
no new jails. Like, oh my God.
But like, it's so funny to watch people's personal politics, I think, ultimately so often just result to PR. They don't actually believe in most of the things that they're espousing, or at the very least, they're not willing to do what it takes to get it, right? It's like, I like this, you always like everything in theory. But when it comes to actual execution, when you tell people, hi, so the marching and stuff is good and great. You showed up to a few marches this summer. That's not enough. They're like, wait.
You got to keep going, even when it's not a hashtag or trending. You got to keep up
when it's
fight.
not that you'll get in trouble for not doing so, which is what it is, right? It's like you're posting about Black Lives Matter now this week, or in the weeks after a black man gets killed by police, because if you don't address it, your followers and people who look at you will go, you're not talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
But guess what? You should be talking about it in the 4 or 5 months we go.
You should be talking about it all the time, fighting for
exactly.
change.
Those things have to be fighting, and like the pressure needs to be put. Not just, it's funny to me though, like watching some of these protests, because I understand the enthusiasm, but I also am like, you're yelling at people eating brunch on the side of the streets when you should be yelling at politicians, right? I'm like, these are the people who actually make the policies and have designed the system. I'm like, you shouldn't be at these places. You should be at Mitch McConnell's house. Like, where, like, these people eating brunch. It's in DC that you're yelling at. DC, they're not even a state. They don't have congressional representatives. Yelling at that lady.
They should be a state.
They should be a state, but they're not even a state. They don't have like, put that energy in like being outside of Republican leaders and even Democratic leaders that aren't doing what they need to be doing.
We gotta push those.
You need to be pushing those people, and like those are the people that actually need. Like, we shouldn't be yes queening and memeing Nancy Pelosi. We should be forcing her and pushing her to adopt Medicare for all instead of endorsing Joe Kennedy over Ed Markey, who supports like more progressive things. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So like that's the kind of thing that we need to be like. That's where the energy I think needs to be focused.
Yes, girl. I agree. I'm with you.
And so I think that that's what's getting lost right now in a lot of like the way that like movement and protest. And I think it doesn't help that like all everybody is focusing on now, because it's the 2 months leading up to the election, is the violence around the protests, because Republicans have ultimately decided that that's their winning political strategy.
But their protesters are the ones that are shooting and killing people.
Exactly.
But they don't talk about that.
They don't. Of course not. Well, those people are trying to get things back to normal by shooting and killing people, right? And I'm like, well, that. And in honesty, it's the most honest thing that they've ever said, because their normal is shooting and killing innocent black people. So that's what they want. Those people are just acting out what Republicans believe is the right and the methodology and the way to go about having a peaceful nation, which is keeping black and oppressed people under their thumb. And if white people have to step up to do it, and including teenagers, then that's what it takes. And that's like, and it just goes to show how willing they are to do anything to uphold those beliefs. You will watch Tucker Carlson and all of these like fake pundits on Republican news. All they do is they go in and they find ways to loop around, make Democratic people mad, and somehow just defend white nationalism. But at least they're very honest about it. That's
every advertiser should pull out of those shows. I think nobody should buy any product from any advertiser who advertises on their shows. It's propaganda. It's propaganda media. I want to change gears a little bit and talk about what we were talking about at the beginning. I think one of the as a white person, I think it's important to show up, listen, learn, and educate myself on what's going on. And one of the things that I found so interesting the past couple of months is the lack of in our schools, whether it's public schools, private schools, any type of schooling in this country, does not teach Black history, Indigenous history, queer history. We are taught the straight, heteronormative, white, wealthy version of history. So I was so excited working with you and Jamie and Shakina and Condola and Deja and all these wonderful people, Destiny, Troy, in June. And I'm so grateful you guys invited me to be a part of that, to put together an Uptown Juneteenth celebration, because I never learned about Juneteenth in school. And I called my parents, who, my dad was born in 1950, my mom was born in 1951. And I asked them, I said, did you ever learn about Juneteenth in school? And they said, no. I mean, they know what it is now, but they said, no, we never learned about that. I called friends of mine, from different parts of the country. And I asked, hey, did you ever learn about this? And they said, no. And I said, our education system, that is a form of segregation in itself, only teaching one side of history, which is, we have Christopher Columbus idolized across this country, but he didn't discover America, and he's a rapist and a pillager, and we live on stolen land. There's all this history that needs to be taught. And so I was so excited to just show up and listen and learn. And I think that's something that we need to be doing as white people. You know, speaking as a white person, is to just listen.
Yeah, organizing that protest and like around Juneteenth was such a great idea. Only in it was educational for people who didn't really know about it, right? Like Juneteenth celebrations, Juneteenth as a thing has been happening for Black people for years before the white people decided to show up this year and recognize it, right? Like it's always Juneteenth has always been a thing. I think the biggest issue with the school system is that it is designed that way though, right? Like we have to remember that we come from a school system that used to be segregated. So of course they're not going to teach you. Those textbooks are not going to teach you the bad things that white people did to Black people, because ultimately they don't see the biggest issues. They don't see them as that bad. So that's the thing, is like they don't see slavery as a massive moral failure. They do not see segregation. They do not see any of those things as bad things, or not nearly as atrocious as they actually are. Right?
It's literal genocide.
Yeah, I'm like, this is genocide. This is terrible.
And I think it's important to be uncomfortable with those conversations and know, like, hey, our ancestors committed genocide and are still committing it through the actions of the police state that we live in.
Exactly. People have to like take into consideration that the education system is built on the foundation of like helping white people get access to helping white people and people with money have access to the best versions of it, and making sure that other people don't have that. And when you set that situation up, it makes total sense why they don't want college education to be free, right? Because like ultimately, education and healthcare are some of the maybe easiest and fastest ways for someone to jump out of poverty, right? To like jump up a class. Is like, if you have education, if you have free health, and you don't have health issues, you don't have like medical debt, then you can jump classes, right? It is a system designed to help people do that if you have access to it. So of course they don't want to make college education free, because then that means Black people might have access to it and might be able to get out of it. They don't want to make healthcare free because poor people might actually like not feel sick and might not be in crippling debt from like their cancer, from their insurance that doesn't cover everything the way that it should. Those people not having those issues makes their lives easier, and it makes them competitors in a market that is meant to be ruled by a specific class of people who have a certain amount of money, a certain skin color, and a certain amount of power. And losing that power is something that they have zero intention on doing. And that's exactly what's happening. And that's why we have the education system the way that we have it now. It's why people don't want to defund. It's why they talk about not defunding the police, and they talk about it as this big, scary thing, because they know that when you take that money and you give it to and you put it in housing, you take $2 billion, you put it into housing, you put it into healthcare, you put it into education initiatives that actually help people.
Free buses,
all of those things to make things more accessible and easier for working class people. They're not going. You'd have less crime, and then the police would have less to do, and that's scary because they want to keep police employed, because they want to keep putting people in prisons, because prisons make money for the government. Like that system is broken, and it has to go away. It is not sustainable, and we keep trying to repurpose it and repackage it and reform it, and I'm like, no, maybe we don't.
We need to rebuild in a new way.
Like get rid of the system
and rebuild, which is what they're doing. Austin, Minneapolis.
Exactly. You're trying to like drive. It's like this car. It's like you have a car that like has a function, right? Like the car goes forward, it does all of these things, and our political aspect or our political hope is that we should just change the driver of the car, right?
We need a brand new car, honey.
And I'm like, yeah, no.
We need a new car.
We need a new car. This car
from a new manufacturer.
This car's running on fossil fuel. Like, we need a green car. We need a brand new car and a new driver for it. You can't just keep changing the driver in the system and think that we're actually going to be able to do it.
This GPS isn't working, bitch. We need a new one.
Get out of the car.
Oh my God.
That's where we.
That's right.
And that's what keeps happening, and that's what we keep like being put in these positions of having. That's what's led us to Donald Trump, right?
Yeah.
It's like we just kept thinking like politically between like rotating between Bush, Obama, the Clintons, all of that rotation. We're just like, oh, we'll just put a new person in the car and like they'll maybe figure it out. No, the car's broke.
It's time for a new car.
It's time. Like it's not. We're not oil. It's not an oil change. We're not changing a tire. It doesn't need a realignment. We need to burn that car to the ground and get a new car.
Yeah, Angela Bassett, light that car on fire, bitch. Yeah, let's go.
And build it and let that car be built by the people who stand the most who need to be passengers in it the most, right? Mm-hmm. Like this car is running people.
There needs to be a seat for everyone in that car.
Exactly. Yes. This car is running people over. Like
I love this analogy.
Right. And like we have to get a new car. It needs to be built by people who know what this car is supposed to do, and then you need to put someone in the driver's seat that can represent those ideals. Otherwise, this is all a waste of time. It's a controlled demolition at that. Like, and outside of that, I'm like, we're just like, we keep pushing. I'm like, we can't reform. Reform is not a thing. But that's not a thing. You can't reform a racist police state. You cannot reform them. Those people cannot be reformed. They are literally, their job is protecting property and wealth for rich people.
We need to put people over profit.
Oh, 100%.
People over profit.
Profit and property, 100%. None of those things matter. Banks don't matter. Buildings don't matter. Those things don't do. All they do is keep
they can be rebuilt. A life can't be brought back.
Exactly. Fuck those things. I don't really care. Like, no shit. Like, fuck that bank. I don't care if someone built. They're like, well, someone built. I'm like, that. You think that that's violence, right? Like, you will focus on the violence of like somebody like breaking into an ATM, but we don't focus on the violence that is like throwing homeless people like out and anywhere that you want.
Evictions are an act of violence.
Exactly.
Experiencing homelessness is an act of violence.
Like all of these things are also equally violent, and that's no issue with that. Nobody bats an eye. Nobody pays attention.
It's morally bankrupt.
Cops going in and destroying tent cities that belong to homeless people because they're like, well, you guys can't be here.
That's violent.
That's violent.
That's violent. That's an act of violence.
Honestly way more violent than breaking in
a window.
Breaking a window to a bank. That's the type of violence that we need to be protesting. And that's the type of violence that we should be focusing on. But nobody focuses on that because, like, all you want to say is like, well, look, they graffitied this Target. Who cares about Target? I don't care about that.
Yeah. Well, the owner of Target was like, I can rebuild my Target.
It's fine. They got money.
Yeah.
They're okay.
Before we continue, we have to take another quick break for our sponsors. So take it away. Oh, thank you so much for your sponsorship. I'm so excited to be here with Phillip Henry, and I want to talk a little bit about your experience in the queer community.
Okay.
Being a queer Black man who does comedy, who is super politically active. What is your experience in our queer life?
Landscape,
our queer landscape.
Yeah. I think that like I'm always evolving, right? Like I've focused, especially the last several years of my life, on like being able to like on educating myself and listening to others who kind of know more than I do, right? Or at least that I think that I'm like, you've dedicated your life to understanding this, right? Like I only listen to dissent really from people who I think like who I value, whose opinions I value or I think are smarter than me, right? Like I'm not, and that's kind of when you're forging, I think, your own path in that way, you're going to meet a lot of opposition. I've certainly pissed off a fair amount of white gay men in my life. I don't really care,
Same.
right? I don't care that you're upset with me, because ultimately you're a white gay man. You being upset with me like does not change anything for my life is. I'm so Black. I'm so gay. My dad is, I'm a Hispanic. My dad is like an illegal immigrant. You know what I'm saying? Like he came here, like he is a legal immigrant now, but he came here illegal, as a teenager. in the 70s. So I ultimately feel like it's a tough navigation because it's also one of those places where like for some reason white queer people, because they're queer, seem to think they know just like about oppression as much as I do simply because they're queer. And I'm like, okay, sure, but like I understand that you have experienced that queerness is a marginalization in itself, but you don't really experience it or know it in the way that I know it because and though it's not an oppression Olympics, right? Like everybody, like we're all not like somebody doesn't have a gold medal or anything. It is to me just this weird entitlement to like everybody else's like political belief system or who they are because we share queerness, and I'm like, we can all share queerness, and my political views are still. I can still. You can say that you're left, and I can still say that no, you're really not, right?
Yeah, no,
like
you're
I can
not,
say,
yeah.
I can go. I can go. You're a centrist, like left person, and I can still despise that just because you're gay. I can like doesn't make that any different for me. I can still despise that because my politics are my politics. They're not like anybody who like just because you're queer and you're not going to convince me otherwise or move me in that way. So that's been, I mean, it's been very interesting. I think over the past like couple of years it's been more I think it's been good in the sense that people are waking up, right? I think slowly
I
but
do think
surely.
so.
I think
so.
slowly
Yeah.
but surely, even the people that I think like aren't
Because
quite,
protests work. Protests work. Yeah.
even the people that aren't quite there. Like I don't think we're gonna save Republicans. I think like those people are kind of like they. I don't know why we keep trying to, right? Like those people are not coming here. They're not. I'm not really interested in saving that many Republicans. What I am interested in is taking people who I think like are already left-leaning people who are already like I'm a Democrat or like I believe in these things and helping them like unlock and really hone in to like what that really means
to take it a
for
step
them.
further
And to move it a little. I'm like, let's move this dial a little far right because I'm like, you're almost there, right? And like we're all for so many people.
We're
I'm
so
like,
close.
I'm like, you're so close to getting it. Like you're so close to getting that. Like this is not just about an election, right? Like this is about an entire state.
And there's work to do in between the elections that we have to do. Yeah.
And before the elections, and before we nominate people, that leads to us having a primary that like gets us a representative democracy that allows people to that allows us to have a candidate that people like really really support, right? And like we've got to move the cog past the, like what we're being told is what works by a group of people who hold a political stronghold and ultimately have been kind of ineffective for us for like 40 years. That's where I'm like with them. I'm like I'm like I get it. I think Democrats mean well as a party, but I'm like you've been meaning well for 40 years,
and now it's time to go a step
and
further.
now we have to go further because if we don't go further, we're just gonna keep going right. And eventually, Mitt Romney is going to be the Democratic nominee for fucking president.
Lord help!
Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh,
and
girl.
people are going to go, well, lesser of two evils. And
I don't want the lesser of two evils. I want to vote for a good person with good values who's going to get shit done.
And I'm like, stop giving me this. Because I also come from the idea, like, even going into 2020. Sure, let's get rid of Donald Trump. But in 2024, I don't think that our that Republicans are going to nominate someone that we're going to see as normal, right? Like, I think that Trump is now ultimately a standard for Republicans. I don't think that there's going to be a Republican nominee for president. There's no going back. Like, there's no going back. Like, they've jumped into this as loyalists. Mitch McConnell, the whole party's involved. They put Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, they're all the way. They're both feet through the door.
They jumped in, like they dove straight in, no problem.
Which is why we need to work that much harder to get to the left. get people further to the left so we can say, okay,
Because-
we need a Green New Deal. We need equal education. We need Medicare for all.
Absolutely.
We need housing justice for all. we
Because
need infrastructure.
I don't think in 2024 that the Republican nominee for president is going to be some mild, moderate Republican. I'm
Yeah.
like, they're going to nominate like Tom Cotton or someone else,
Or Ivanka.
or someone,
Like, that's what they're
or
grooming.
like Donald Trump Jr. or like someone who believes QAnon conspiracy theories. Like, that's what they're going to go with forever. So forever we're going to be in this argument of like lesser of two evils, because like you just want to beat this person who's really bad. No, give me someone not evil. Like, that's what we need as a democracy for the
to save our
future of this
democracy,
country.
yeah.
You talk about saving this democracy. We've got to stop playing this lesser of two evils game, because it's only a control. Like, the lesser of two evils game got us Donald Trump, and it's going to continue to get us further right, wilder Republican nominees for president. There are QAnon people right now winning primaries. Okay?
Oh, that one woman. She
Marjorie
nuts.
Taylor Greene, Laura Loomer is like
Nuts.
out there winning. Like, these are nut jobs.
Oh, and we thought Michelle Bachmann was bad. Remember her?
Yeah,
This
I'm
real
like,
bad.
We thought we thought Sarah
Sarah
Palin.
Palin.
was
Oh my
bad.
God.
And I'm like, these people.
That seems like a lifetime
I'm
ago,
like,
doesn't it?
this is Republicans have gone all in.
Honey, they have
on
jumped
this,
fully
like,
off the ship.
Exactly. They don't give a fuck anymore, because they think there used to be a point where they had like where a lot of Republican arguments were like
It's a
religious
cult.
and
I think it's a
moral
cult.
and like a religious moral issue. Like the Republicans it was still racism, but at least it was wrapped up in some sort of morality at this point. At this point, that is not the case. They have like fully jumped into this death cult where they're like, nope, Republicans till we die, and like they don't.
It's a cult. It is
and
truly
it
a
is
cult.
absolutely a cult. And I think that like those people, you're not going to get them out of it, right? Like I think that especially now that they've Trump has shown them that they can win with this. So ultimately, they can win, and that they can win congressional seats with this too. So like when they've made such a far jump that way, I think that the only path forward is for us to be like staunchly, like instead of trying to get the 2 to 4% of undecided Republicans, we need to be motivating and like mobilizing progressive voters and younger voters
in every single election,
and
in between elections,
and between them too. I think Ed Markey is a really good example of
Team Markey. Love him.
Of this entire thing, because in his race against Joe Kennedy has Kennedy name. He is centrist. He had Nancy Pelosi's endorsement and was running on a campaign platform that was like fairly moderate to like almost Republican in my opinion. Anything that like isn't like, you know, I'm very particular. I'm like, if you don't believe in Medicare for all, you're a Republican. Like that's the way I see it. And we watched Ed Markey, who who wasn't like pro climate change, wasn't pro Medicare for all. He has kind of like a shaky history with voters. Is a very flawed candidate. Was a very flawed candidate. Adopted some progressive values. 2 of them, just 2 issues. Like I believe in Medicare for all. I believe in the Green New Deal, and was able to like best somebody by being a flawed candidate, adopting progressive things, and it turned out a lot of young voters and a lot of progressive people to support him. So this idea that there's a purity test for people who are like more progressive.
Growth. Like he showed up, he listened, and he said, "You know what?
And he made those
These
changes.
are things that we need." He was like, "I fucked up in the past. Let's fix that."
And like there's a lesson to be learned maybe from. I'm like Democrats as a thing should be looking at that and understanding like this guy wasn't great. He picked up some progressive ideals, and despite our best efforts to make sure that like he did not win because he was too far left, because you're like. Nancy Pelosi, the DNC, the establishment is like, no, we're going to try and get Joe Kennedy this seat now. Despite their best efforts, he still managed to win, right? He managed to get his victory in Massachusetts, and that's the kind of that's a lesson you should be taking for things like the general election. I'm like, just adopt a single progressive policy, Medicare for all, legalizing marijuana, one thing. Just do one thing and watch your voter turnout change.
It will shift, yeah.
It's so important, and we keep like I'm like, you keep not doing that and thinking that it's going to work because they're banking on the Obama thing, like Obama's massive turnout. And I'm like, Obama was black. Like there was so much different going on because I think that Obama also represented like two people at the time, a hope or like a goalpost of where America could be. And whether he was able to actually fulfill those duties or not is up for debate. I don't think that he ultimately really. I think that we should have aspired a little higher, not outside of like him being, but just like on policies. I've also realized that like it's important to stay in policies and not politicians. I don't care about the politician. I don't care about your identity.
Stop making politicians celebrities.
They're not celebrities. Yeah. These people work.
They work for us. We sign their check.
They work for us, and like what we need to be focusing on is not like, oh well, we got a lesbian like into a like does that lesbian support climate change reform?
Yeah. Are they progressive?
Are they progressive? Do they like stand policy?
We need true progressives. True progressives.
I'm like, what I can't deal with is like any more of this like weird like sanctimony and like jumping around just like a party that doesn't really represent ideals that we need them to represent. And like we have to look at that because it's ultimately it's not sustainable to keep relying on what we're relying on now. Like
stop relying on that shitty policy.
Like it's not gonna work. It's not turning out voters the way that you think it does.
That's right. We got to get people excited and engaged. I would. Oh my god. I'd have you on another episode. You're like, honey. You're like, we are throwing down facts.
Yeah, we're changing. I've in the past, especially like this year, I've had plenty of time to do a lot of reading and spend a lot of time like focusing on like how to enact change, how change has best been enacted, and to like develop and like focus on my own politics, right? Like that's what's important. It's like I can't go to someone and convince them that my politics are right if I haven't like spent enough time doing the research and like actually making sure that like not just what do I believe, but why do I believe it? How does that thing get accomplished and who benefits from accomplishing those things? Those are really important questions that everybody should be asking before you believe something and before you jump on board with an idea of just like this incremental change or accepting a lower compromise. And like I can't do that. For me, I believe what I believe. And it took me a while to get here. But trust me, 4 years ago, I would have been a very different person on this very same podcast, having this very same conversation. It took watching this all happen and exploring how we got there, how we got to Trump.
I'm running for office, and I never thought that that's something I would do. But it's like, okay,
you got to do it.
Here we are.
Yeah,
we gotta wake up, America.
Yeah, America has to that's it, right?
We gotta wake up.
It's getting people who actually believe these things and understand like the importance and their gravity, and not just into office, but like marching into the streets, right? Like not everybody can run for office. You're not always, but we can bully our own politicians.
Bully the politicians. Take to the streets. Do your research.
Bully them and like ask yourself all of the questions about like everything that you believe, why you believe it, why you're supporting it, who stands to benefit it, how we can best get it enacted, and the long term, either long and short term, like pros and cons of what we're saying,
what we're doing,
and then evaluate the long term consequences as if we don't make those changes, right? Like the consequences of like not making climate change.
We're not gonna have a planet. We're not gonna have a fucking planet if we don't do it. Like this is not just like this is a policy thing to put on our website. Like no. Our planet is dying. There's wildfires in California. That. There is the Greenland's ice shelf is melting. The Arctic ice shelf is melting. New York is now a subtropical climate.
Yeah.
Fucking New York. All right. Oh my God. We can go out.
Yeah, we can do this all day.
Green New Deal, bitch. We need it. All right. I love you. We got to wrap up. Everybody follow Phillip Henry on social media. What's the Twitter?
Major Celebrity on everything. MAJORPHILEBBRITY. Yeah, follow me on everything. I'm putting everybody's feet to the fire.
Bam!
Democrats, Republicans alike.
Everybody.
It's not. We got to change.
Oh, girl, we're doing it. I love you so much. Thank you, Phillip, for being on the
Thank
show.
you. Thank you for having me.
Yes, honey. This is another episode of Marti Talks. I'm your host, Marti Gould Cummings. This show is produced by Purse First Productions, Bob the Dry Queen, Mitch Farino. Tune in next time. Like, comment, subscribe, share, and send us your questions. Thanks so much. Have a beautiful, blessed day. Take the census.
Yes.
Register to vote.
Be counted.
Go vote. Bye-bye.